In today's parable of the vineyard, Jesus is using an image which is deeply embedded in the scriptures of Israel. An image that lies very close to the soil and indeed in the soil. The image of planting a vineyard, hoping for it to produce, tending that vineyard, coming along at harvest time and feeling disappointment, and more disappointment, and more disappointment, until finally the vineyard has to go. There needs to be a change. A decision that only comes with a sense of despair, because of all the work that has gone into choosing the place for the vineyard, planting it, and anticipating a good result. But a farmer is a farmer, and there comes a time that if the results are not there, despite the added effort, the vineyard has to be dug up. Such, says the prophet Isaiah, is God. God is in the position of doing the best for his people because he expects the best out of them. He looks for justice. He looks for righteousness. If instead he finds injustice, what do you think happens, says Isaiah. And this understanding of the people of God as a vineyard grew so deep within the consciousness of ancient Israel that we also see it reflected in today's psalm, which, like most of the psalms, is intended to be sung by Israelites as they worship in the temple. It reflects the recognition: we are that vineyard, and we have not been all that productive. And we have been more than pruned. We have been part uprooted. And so we look again to do justice, to seek righteousness, in order to bring about a change, to be once again the productive vineyard that God desires. Jesus, in his use of the parable today, had a particular target in mind. And we can see at the close of today's gospel that the parable reached the target, because it says, when the chief priests and the Pharisees heard his parables, they realized that he was speaking about them. The shoe fit, however uncomfortable. Well, how is it, since this understanding of Israel as vineyard is so widespread in the scriptures of Israel, that the chief priests and the scribes knew that Jesus was getting at them? Well, to some extent you could respond, who else would he be criticizing? After all, they are his favorite opponents at this time of his life, when he had just occupied the temple with his followers. But there's also a more specific reason, and it lies in the way in which that first reading, the parable from the book of Isaiah, chapter 5, was widely understood in the time of Jesus. In that time, when they spoke of the vineyard in their favorite version of the Old Testament, which was not in Hebrew, but in Aramaic, the language that they spoke. In their Aramaic version, that vineyard was in fact the temple. And the tenants, therefore, were the people in charge of the temple: the chief priests, the Pharisees, the scribes. God, said Jesus, will take it away from you. Instead of uprooting the vineyard, he'll just change the tenancy and make it productive in that way. Why? Because in Jesus' prophetic perspective, and by the way, in the perspective of many people at the time, the chief priests and the Pharisees and the scribes were running the temple in their own interests instead of for the greater good of Israel and the worship of God. That, said Jesus, is unacceptable. This self-referential tendency in religion has to be spurred and replaced with an honest regard for God as being at the very center of worship. That's why he acted so forcibly in throwing the vendors of animals out of the temple, and that's why also he told this parable pointed against the chief priests, as a reminder of what the people of God are here to do. They're here in order to be just towards God and to be righteous towards one another. For this reason, during the same period, Jesus explained that all the law and the prophets can be summed up in the commandments to love God and to love neighbor. In doing that, just as he was reaching down into the image of the vineyard, so also he was reaching into the inheritance of Israel. Because if you look at the Ten Commandments, which basically give you the orientation of the entire law of Moses in those first 5 books that open the Bible, those 10 Commandments also consist of imperatives for how you go about being just to God first. How do you do that? Well, you don't put something else in front of God. You don't invent something in place of God. That's an idol. You don't take God's name in vain. And you deliberately set aside time to worship him. That's how you love God. Well, how would you go about loving a neighbor? Well, you could start with your parents. What would be a loving society? Maybe one where there's not murder and theft and adultery. That would be good. And if we can understand those as basic principles of righteousness, then not lying also seems straightforward. And then most profoundly, learning in community how not to covet. Because that last commandment, thou shalt not covet, is also key to understanding Jesus' commandment to love your neighbor as yourself. Because when we are motivated by greed, we know very well that that is the very opposite of love. We know what greed can do. We have seen it devastate the largest economy in the world. It will take us years to recover. The fact that it will take us years to recover should not come as a surprise to anyone. Because watching that damage is as painful as uprooting a vineyard. The uprooting has occurred. It is time to replant. And in the replanting, to understand who we are. We are a community planted by God to be with one another and to learn how to love him by means of worship and how to care for one another by means of what we do. Then we are the vineyard that God has always desired. Now to God, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, be ascribed as is most justly due, all might, majesty, dominion, and power, this day and forevermore.